Hi, I'm Christy, Associate Editor here at Bookstr. Joining us today is author Timothy J. Smith, who has written The Fourth Courier. We are so excited to have him all the way from Nice. Welcome, Timothy.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, Timothy is promoting his new release, The Fourth Courier, which is a really exciting international thriller with LGBT themes and characters. But before we get into this really exciting novel, I'm sure our audience would love to hear more about your very exciting background. Could you give us a bit of an overview about your professional history and some of your travels?
Sure. Before I became a full-time writer, I was working around the world doing work on projects benefiting low-income people, basically. I had several different areas of expertise, and I ended up working in about 33 countries and traveled over 100 countries. The Fourth Courier is really based on my experiences in Poland over a 2-year period that I lived there in the early 1990s, right at the time of the big change from communism to a market economy. And that was really the years of 1990 to 1992.
Poland is a very prominent setting for you because you also use it in How High the Moon, your award-winning play.
Right, I do.
What about Poland speaks to you so much or feels right to you as a setting?
Well, Warsaw itself is a quite interesting city. It's very atmospheric. In the winter, it's a little gloomy. But I really enjoyed being there, and I love the Polish people. It was just a great experience. And so I have gone back there in terms of my writing a couple times to use that as a setting for a story.
Do you feel that that's some place that you might return to in the future? Not geographically, of course, but in terms of your writing.
I could, but I will definitely return geographically as well. I have lots of friends there, and I'm up there every year or two for a little bit of time. And I was just there about 2 months ago to do actually a short video for this novel. So yeah, I'll go back there.
Yes, I know how important the people were to you that you met in Poland because people and characters are very important throughout your work. You've said that you've met some incredibly interesting people like, mercenaries and arms dealers,
Yeah, that's
fishermen. Is there any one person that really sticks out to you the most? Someone that just completely changed your life to meet them?
Wow. I
I
never
know
thought
it's a
about that
big
question
question.
before. Yeah. No, I don't think I could say that actually. I have gathered my characters for my work from all the travel that I've done, and the work that I did put me in very intimate settings with people. I was working on like low income housing, and so I have to go and talk to families and find out what they could really afford, what could really be done, and you really learn about a lot of people when you're asking those kind of questions and sitting around in the houses and stuff like that. So I've drawn on really a lot of characters that I've met around the world for all of my work. And each of my novels, this is my third published novel. I've got two more ready to go. One's almost finished and one I'm just starting. But they all take place in different locations around the world, and I draw on those experiences.
And how do you go about the process of kind of transforming a real person that you've met into a fictional character? Where is that sort of line for you?
That's a good question also because you don't really want to make it too apparent who
Of
the
course.
person is.
In case they read
And
it, which let's,
in case you read it,
yeah,
right. Exactly. It just depends on each piece of work. A book I've set in Greece, that's really the next thing that I'll be sending into the publisher. It's a very personal story. The characters are people I've known for years. I think they probably will recognize themselves in the book. But what I really heard in my head, I make up the stories, but I hear their voices, and so
right.
that gives me a sense of their character. And so I try not to take too much from any one person, but sometimes it's impossible not to.
Of course, that completely makes sense. Well, throughout your travels, you have done some pretty interesting things besides just the traveling itself. You
Right.
speak on your website about how you smuggled a play from the Iron Curtain. Could you tell us some more about that? Our audience would really be interested to hear in some of your exploits.
Yeah, that took place back in 1974, and I was traveling through Eastern Europe, which was unusual to do at that time. But I happened to, I was leaving Greece and I wanted to travel north, and I just was able to go to Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And while I was in Czechoslovakia, I had a friend there who was studying Slavic studies, and he was in the Slavic department at a university there. And there was a playwright. I have no idea who the playwright was, but I was asked to bring bring a play out and bring it to the Slavic language department at UC Berkeley, which is where I was a student. And I did. And years later, it might have been Havel. I don't know. I don't know whose play. I don't know. But at that time, it was just, okay, I'll do that. It didn't seem like a big deal, but it was actually a fairly dangerous thing when I think about it.
At what point did you realize just how dangerous that was? Was there a moment that it dawned on you, or did you just kind of put the pieces together gradually and think, wow, I got away with that?
Yeah, I'll be honest. So when I look back at some of the things that I did as a young man, I sort of scare myself. I worry about myself. I think, how did I do that? I was off. This is before there was internet or email or anything, and I was traveling around the world.
No one to check in on you. Yeah.
No one to check in on me, and I ended up being in a couple of fairly dangerous situations that at the time I actually knew they were dangerous, but getting into those situations, I wasn't expecting that. But then things happened. So,
of course. Would you be willing to share any circumstance in which you realized that you might have been in serious danger?
Sure. The story I like to tell is I was trying to visit a friend who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal. And I was living in Greece at the time. And I thought, well, I'll just go to the nearest port to Africa and then take a boat down to Senegal. And I did that, and I went to Lisbon. Okay. And I discovered that there were no boats from Lisbon to Senegal, but I could fly to the Cabo Verde or Cape Verde Islands just off the coast of Africa. And I did that. I flew down there, and I discovered that there were no boats from there either. And the next airplane trip back to Lisbon was 2 weeks later. And I was not in a very good situation in terms of money, communication, whatever. But there was a situation that had developed between Senegal and the country on its southern border, where I believe it was something like Senegal and Guinea-Bissau were in some sort of political conflict. Somebody had murdered a revolutionary leader in one of the other countries. And so those two countries, anything Portuguese was stopped coming into Senegal.
Okay.
Well, I was in Cabo Verde was a Portuguese colony. So along comes this cargo ship, this American cargo ship that wanted to go from Cabo Verde directly to Senegal, and I was able to get on that boat, but I was treated like a stowaway. I was not allowed inside the boat at all. Wow. I was 3 days on the deck. I had no food. I had there was one flying fish that came flying over the deck and hit the deck, and I grabbed it and I traded it for 2 biscuits. That was the only food I had for 3 days. And when I got to Senegal, I found out that I was only allowed in the country if I had a ticket out of the country. So the police took me to the police station. We got into an argument, and I was put under boat arrest. I was taken back to the boat. My passport was confiscated. And the boat was going to leave the next day for an 8-day journey to Puerto Rico, and I was never going to be seen again. That I was very clear about. And
that is astonishing.
It was pretty scary. I was on the deck of the boat, and I called out to anybody who passed by to please contact the American Embassy. I told them my name, everything like that, and ultimately, who showed up was actually the chief of police, and he. In Senegal, in Dakar,
of course,
and he sort of solved the problem for me. It was a little scarier than actually making it out to be, but it was very clear that I was not going to survive that trip if somebody didn't come and rescue me.
It might be scarier than you're making it out to be, but you are definitely making it out to be pretty scary. So we're definitely glad that you got through that one and, literally lived to tell another tale, as you are a novelist. It's really no wonder that you can come up with such remarkable and fascinating stories, given that the ones you've lived yourselves are so wild.
Yeah, that story I actually tell in another book that I wrote called Cooper's Promise, which is about human
Yeah.
trafficking. And while I was stuck for 2 weeks in Cabo Verde, I ended up going to basically a bar every night just because that's the place to hang out. And that's where the whole story of Cooper's Promise got developed because I met the young girls who were basically trafficked, I suppose, but I didn't know that. They were, to me, they were just young, poor girls who were had a job there. And um, it was, that's it. There were a lot of stories that came out of that particular adventure in Cabo Verde.
Of course. At what point did you realize that they were being trafficked? When did that occur to you?
It did not occur to me at that time. I
Of
just
course.
thought they were young, poor girls who had to go to do prostitution because that's all that was really
Right.
available for them to survive. I later, and I had heard, about trafficking a little bit in my life, but it wasn't until several years later that NPR did a interview. It was Neil Conan on Talk of the Nation, who was interviewing the National Geographic reporter who did the story I think it was September 2003 National Geographic on modern day slavery and the extent of the trafficking, just the magnitude that at that point there was something like 26 million slaves in the world, and most of those were
Yeah.
young women. 70% of them were young women in sexual slavery. It was a shocking thing to me. That's when I looked back and I realized that's what I was also experiencing in other places when I saw these women. But I
Definitely.
just didn't know enough about it at the time to put it in those terms.
Absolutely. Has it been challenging for you emotionally to kind of be in these circumstances and see the way that people live, sometimes in, very upsetting conditions?
I decided very early in my life, while still in high school, I developed a sense of sort of social consciousness and social
Yes.
justice and economic justice.
So important.
I wanted to help low income people. That's what I set myself out to do in a career. And I did that. And so I wasn't so upset by seeing it as, I mean, obviously when you see extreme poverty, of course it's upsetting, but I put myself in those situations by choice because I knew I could do something also worthwhile. And in all of my work, how I come up with a story, I say, oh, what issue would I like to deal with at this point, and what kind of story and what kind of characters? When I Before I knew much about human trafficking, I was actually planning to do a story on blood diamonds or the conflict
Yes.
diamonds out of West Africa. And I was on my way to Antwerp in a few days when this Neil Conan story came on the radio. And I decided, well, I can do a story that's both blood diamonds and human trafficking because they're both coming out of West Africa. And that's why I picked it, that's why I chose that sort of story. I wanted to basically highlight these conditions and let people know about them.
Of course.
So
You're a very socially aware author, which is part of why we have you on Bookstr Diversity. One thing that you've spoken on that we admire so much is how you feel that thrillers and mysteries are kind of unexplored territory for LGBT characters. That's not a representation that happens very frequently in that genre. And you, of course, include, a very prominent LGBT character in The Fourth Courier. You have throughout most of your work. So we are really, really pleased to be able to talk about that. What led you to make that decision to kind of begin that representation where there really wasn't a whole lot, even earlier in your career?
well, when I first started writing, I actually had friends say to me, don't get pigeonholed as a gay writer because nobody will take you very seriously. I think the idea was that gay writers just write about sex and more sex and more sex, and
Of
that's about
course,
it.
right? The
But
objectification.
right, exactly. But I saw the world through my eyes as a gay man, and I knew gay professionals, and I knew gay people in these different situations, and I just felt I wanted to make those characters be more prominent. I don't know what else to say. Just I'm gay, and it just makes sense to me. In fact, the Fourth Courier is the only thing I've written where the actual protagonist is not a gay man. It's actually he teams up with a guy in the story, as you know, and they really become kind of a duo that work together. And I think it works very well in the Fourth Courier. I like that kind of dynamic.
I would agree. What kind of led you to make the decision to have the protagonist or one of the FBI agents be straight, right? You have a straight white man and a gay black man. Could you tell us more about how that dynamic came to you?
It just is how the characters came to me. I just thought about them that way. And the Fourth Courier is really the second novel that I worked on. I set it aside for a long time after I drafted. I finished a book called A Vision of Angels, which is set in Israel, Palestine. And in that it weaves together the lives of four families, four people. And the American in that story is a gay journalist. And then when I did the Fourth Courier, I sat down right away. I didn't want to lose in my mind what I knew about Poland. It had been a few years since I'd lived there. I knew I was going to become a full-time writer, so I basically drafted this thing. But that's just how the characters came to me, that I wanted to make the main character this FBI agent, and he's going to be white, and I was going to have this black guy who's going to be the CIA agent, and they're going to have this great repartee, and that's what happened.
Yeah. Well, we definitely think it's really wonderful to see that representation in this genre where there is so little, actually, which is really quite a shame. So thank you for including including your perspective. When you set that book aside for a while, what kind of themes were you developing in your mind? What did you hope to gain from that break from working on it?
I went on to other things. That's when I wrote How High the Moon, which you mentioned, my first play. I had decided to try my hand at screenwriting. In fact, there's a story there. I was taking a workshop with Sebastian Junger, who wrote The Perfect Storm, and he had just sold the film rights to The Perfect Storm. And I asked him, is he going to be writing the screenplay? And he said he would have nothing to do with it. And I was really finishing up my first novel, and my heart and soul was going into this thing. And I thought,
absolutely.
If I sold the film rights, I'd want to have at least enough information, enough knowledge how to have some sort of artistic input into that. Even if I couldn't write the whole thing, I'd at least be able to talk to somebody who's writing it and give them my input. So I took some screenwriting courses, and I started writing screenplays, and I did that for 5 or 6 years, and then went back to novels.
Of course. As a more technical writing question, because a lot of our audience, people who love books are often aspiring authors, love the writing questions. So when a story kind of comes into your mind, do you know right away whether it would be better as a novel or a screenplay?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and what kind of leads you to that conclusion?
I guess I just sort of feel that. I feel like how complex. With a novel, you can go off in several different directions. In the screenplay, you've got to stay really on kind of a central dramatic through story. And actually, what I do now is my last edit on a novel is actually converting it to a screenplay, adapting it, because it really lets me see what's not necessary, and it might not be necessary in the novel either. Because if it's not necessary in the screenplay, maybe it's not necessary in the novel. It also helps me tighten the dialogue.
Of course,
it just gives me a real through story. So, to me, they kind of work together.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. So what we're going to do now is, sorry, please finish.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so some people always ask me, how do you come up with your stories, or how do you know you're ready to write? And, I'm sort of driven by the idea that I want to write about something, not a message sort of thing. I'm not pounding people over the head about messages about blood diamonds or human trafficking or what it was like for living under communism in Poland. That's sort of the fabric that's part of the whole story. And then I think, well, who's my main character? Who am I really going to have as a character? And then if I have an opening scene in my head and a closing scene in my head, I'm ready to write. Everything else will come.
That is excellent. And all of your works are so deeply immersed in a sense of place. Even if I didn't know, or your readers didn't know, that you had been to all these countries and that you had been to so many, I think it would be quite apparent from the words on the page.
I only write about places that I've been to for for extended periods of time. I don't,
Hmm.
I've been to a lot. I've been to 112 countries.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna write a book about Ecuador, having been there for 2 weeks. It's just not that. But when it comes to Greece or Poland or other places where I've spent
Hmm.
2 or 3 years, then I feel I can really write about that. I've spent a couple of years in Jerusalem, so I felt I
Yeah.
could write about that conflict with some sort of authenticity and some sort of authority.
Of course. Are there any places that you've been to that you haven't written anything about yet, but you feel that that place has a story for you to tell?
I'm just starting one of those stories now.
Yes.
I'm writing my new novel that I'm well into in terms of creating the story. I haven't gotten very far in writing it because I've been promoting this book a little bit
Right.
too much. But
Hmm. Not too
uh,
much at all. People will definitely love this one
yeah,
who haven't
yeah.
read it yet.
Thank you. I'm writing the story of a Syrian refugee, a gay Syrian refugee,
Yeah.
who has ended up in Istanbul and gets recruited by the CIA to go deep undercover with ISIS. And the backstory for this character is very interesting. I know a lot of I've met a lot of Syrians in my life.
Hmm.
A couple of years ago, when the refugee crisis in Greece was so prominent in the news, 70,
Absolutely.
80% of those people were Syrians. And I've been going to Greece for years. And the
Hmm.
island that we go to happened to be ground zero for a 500,000 refugees landed next to our village in a 12-month period.
What an
So
experience.
yeah, it was incredible. And so I feel I can write. I feel like I've talked to a lot of Syrian refugees. I can tell those stories, and now I'm setting the story in Istanbul for different reasons. It's kind of an exotic place, anyway.
Absolutely. And because you have such a personal stake in it and a background of being there, it's just going to read as all the more true.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, people
Oh,
were really.
definitely.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, like with the Fourth Courier, a lot of the comments I get are how realistic this is, and just
Yeah.
the details without being too detailed, but just the things I drop in every once in a while. They go, "Oh yeah, that's exactly what it's like or was like." So yeah, I feel like I can do that.
And tone is so important to you as a novelist, so you probably feel like all these different cities have their own distinctive energies.
Definitely, right? They do.
Of course. So, what we're going to do now is we have some questions from our audience.
Okay.
People have a lot they want to ask you. So, our first question, which comes from Richard, is what advice would you give to someone that may want to be in your line of work?
My line of work being
I would assume
right.
novelist. Or, you can answer that question however you want because you have led a very interesting life.
Yeah. Well, my line of work now and has been for 20 years is basically being a full-time writer,
Yeah.
and you, you just have to do it. And I know a lot of people who say, "Oh, I always wanted to write a novel. I've always wanted to write a novel." Well, novel starts with the first word. You got to sit
Hmm.
down and start doing it. Um, yeah, and write what you know about, because that's the easiest thing to write about. Even if it's exotic, it can be what you still know about.
Yeah, that's great advice. As for just kind of sitting down and getting into it, how long does it typically take you to finish a draft? Is there a typical range, or does it depend on the story?
I think I'm asked that question a lot, and I basically say, as a rule of thumb, for me personally, it takes me 6 months to write a screenplay. It takes me
Hmm.
3 years to write a novel.
Okay.
But that's really going through many, many, many rewrites as well.
Hmm. Of
So
course.
it's not just like, oh, finally 3 years later I finally get to the last word. No, I've been to the last word a year and a half earlier. It's just, once you get through a novel, you got to go back and, the art of writing is rewriting. People often say that, and it's really true.
Absolutely. There's plenty behind the scenes that we don't see.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about your rewriting process?
I just sort of edit, and I tighten the dialogue, and
Yes, with
dialogue is
your.
very important,
Hmm.
very, very important to me in my work. And I think that's why I also enjoy screenplays, because screenplays are really, it's all dialogue. I mean, there's very little description on a page in a screenplay.
Absolutely.
So it's sort of setting, and then it's dialogue.
Yes, that makes complete sense based on just all of your work. The dialogue is so crisp and the setting so richly realized. So our next question from Matthew. Do you feel like traveling as much as you have, did that help with your writing? And do you recommend that people also do that if they want to be writers?
I don't think you have to travel at all to be a writer. I mean, there's a lot of stories. I mean, just all around you. It's just a matter of what your circumstances are. I had an experience when I was 12 years old. I'm going to tell you how I got into all this
Oh,
travel and
yes,
everything.
please do. Please do.
It was my elementary school. I was in sixth grade. Had a spaghetti fundraiser dinner, and it was for $1 all you can eat spaghetti. And I was sitting across the table from a guy that must have been really. He seemed really old to me. He's probably like 35 years old, but I was 12, so he seemed very old. And he started telling me that he'd been to 40 countries and he spoke 5 languages. And on the spot, I said to myself, "That's the life I want." And so I pursued a career that would take me around the world. And then on top of that, I wanted to do good things for people. So I was able to go out and do work in third world countries and really make a difference in people's lives. And so I benefited from all these experiences, and I was benefiting other people, and it's just a great symbiotic relationship.
Of
And that's
course.
what I did. But you don't have to be traveling around the world to write. Yes, travel has really benefited me because, and particularly living overseas, not just
Right.
traveling through a place, but where you really get to know what's happening culturally and how people are responding to things. I mean, one of the things that I want to say on this discussion about diversity in my work
Of course.
is that um, I've lived long enough in places like Thailand and Greece and Poland and other
Yes.
places that I understand what those societies think about gay people and how they respond to them. And in each of my stories, including the Fourth Courier, um, what the plot really turns on is an event or a moment that could only happen because somebody is gay.
Yeah.
It's not, yes, I could have written the story a different way and I could have gotten to the same place possibly, but in each story, it's different because culturally, homosexuality is dealt with differently in different places. So and I think I kind of bring that's something I didn't start out as a writer thinking, oh, I want to portray gays around the world and what their lives are like, because I think most of us could kind of guess what most of their lives are like anyway.
Yeah.
But to portray it with a cultural context where that's going to happen here or that's going to happen there. I mean, what happens in my Greek book is so totally different from what's going to happen in my Syrian book, which is so totally different from what happens in my Polish
Of
book.
course, because of the
So
cultural context.
the cultural context, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, 40 countries seemed like a lot then, and it is a lot, but after
It is a lot.
112,
I know.
can't seem like that many to you.
It's okay.
So, our next question from Brianna is, what was your favorite part of writing The Fourth Courier, and what was the hardest part of writing it for you?
The favorite part is chapter 6, and I call it Emma's story. And it is a train ride across Russia where a mad Russian scientist and a Russian immigrant from America are in this first class carriage together. And virtually everything that happens in that chapter actually occurred in real life to me many years ago.
Okay.
It was really a crazy scene in a train. And I've always laughed whenever I've thought about that scene, and I knew someday I would use it, and I did. And it's a scene that they always say what's it called, the Chekhov principle, I think it is.
Chekhov's gun?
The Chekhov gun, right? Where if you're going to introduce something, you got to use it further down, in the story. If you're going to show somebody a gun in the story, you got to use that gun at some point. It better be fired. And in chapter 6, Emma's story, Emma is only in that scene, but what it gives is so much psychology for the Russian physicist that it's a really critical scene in the story, and I loved writing it. I really loved writing that. I'm not sure what the most difficult part was. I really don't know. I'm sure I can answer that.
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of moments throughout your life that has been so exciting. When you experience them, you think, I'm going to write about this later for sure. So let's take another question. Oh, yes. Okay, so this one is from Laura Blaze, who is our editor in Ireland. You've traveled so extensively. Do any countries stand out as your favorites or the most inspirational yet?
Uh, Probably Greece. My first job after the university, after college, was in Greece. That was back in 1972, before graduate school, so 72 to 74. And I ended up living on an island, which is very popular now, but at the time had no airport. And I was sometimes the only foreigner on the island during the
Right.
winter. And I still go back. I've now spent probably cumulative 6 to 7 years of my life in Greece total. I really love
Wow.
the country,
Is
and I
that the
really love the people.
longest? Is that the longest you've spent in any foreign country, or would
Yeah, it
that
is.
be?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes, yes, it is. Yeah. Most of the work that I did uh, was under contract with either the U.S. Agency for International Development or the World Bank or places like that, and those tend to be 2.5 year contracts, and they can be renewed. But that's a sort of the project cycle. So most of the places I just spent a couple of years.
And one more question from Sage. This is a really good one. Have any other LGBT thrillers inspired you, or did you write yours based on the absence?
Neither one. I haven't been inspired by any others because I don't really know of any others.
Maybe
I think
some
I've got to
others will
think
be
of it.
inspired by you.
Well, maybe I hope so. Yeah. And I didn't really set out to fill the void exactly. I just knew the kind of story I wanted to write. I like stories that are fairly fairly well fairly fast paced. I like things. I like there to
Yes.
be a little bit of action, but I don't want it to be entirely driven by action. I like to deal with really characters and what really happens. What an event or what a threat or what some sort of thriller event means to people in their daily lives, in their ordinary people's lives. And but I wasn't really out to set the world on fire as a gay writer. This is how I saw the world, and these are the characters I came up with. And wasn't really being to the in out there on as a vanguard or something. It's just how I
Yeah.
wrote. It's just what I wanted to write.
Sharing your own perspective, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one more thing on the subject of the fourth courier. So if you had to tell our audience something you would like them to know that is not on the back jacket or in the description, right? Something to tantalize them into picking it up. What information would you share?
I wish you'd give me that question ahead of time. I could have thought about it. I don't know.
Anything
I'm
that comes to
thinking.
you.
Uh, what's on the back cover? I think what I want to say is that the publicity for a thriller is it really tends to focus on the action sort of stuff, and a lot of in this case, a lot of the men in the book, because the two guys that team up, it's two men who actually solve this case. But what's not really as apparent to people is that there's a lot more going on in the story. Jay, the main character, has an affair with a Polish woman and gets very involved with her family. And it's through that situation that we begin to see what really the family life is like for the Poles back in the early 1990s when all this stuff was happening. And they were just coming off of 45 years of oppression. The communist system was really terribly inefficient in terms of just producing houses or food or whatever. And so there's a lot more to the book than just, oh yeah, let's go find who's got this nuclear bomb or
Yeah.
something. But it's really much more a story about the Polish people. And I think somebody the other day in an interview asked me, well, what's in the book for women? I mean, it all
Hmm.
sounds like a man's book. Well, there's a lot in the book for women, and that's not what really comes across on the back cover.
Excellent. So it's not just fast-paced, it's also very intimate, which is wonderful.
It's very intimate, yes.
So we were going to wrap up, but we just got one more great question that I'd love to ask you.
Okay.
So this is from Sabrina. You've obviously seen so much in your line of work prior to writing full-time. How do you decide how political to get in your writing when you've seen so much that is tied to politics?
I think that all the things I've written at some level are political pieces in the sense that I'm dealing with critical issues that affect people's lives. So whether it's the Middle East conflict or human trafficking, these things that I've mentioned, they're all sort of political, but I don't want to be out there with a hammer beating people over the head with a message
Right.
so it's a matter of really taking these bigger picture issues and telling an intimate story that reflects them. In fact, I'm actually the founder of a national playwriting prize called the Smith Prize for Political Theater, and that's the instruction of what kind of play the prize looks for, which is hello, are you there? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We'll be right back with Timothy in a moment. The call is reconnecting. But isn't he great, though? Isn't he great?
Do you hear the beep? What's that? I've lost the connection. Are we back?
Yes, we are back. All right. Thank you, Bookstr audience, for having patience with us while we lost reception for the call.
But I'm just going to finish my answer to that question that Sabrina asked.
Please do. We all want to hear.
Which is, I basically, what I said, what are in the guidelines for this playwriting prize is deal with the big picture issue, but through an intimate story. So if you've got an issue that you want to deal with immigration or racism or genetic engineering or whatever these playwrights have come up with, do it through an intimate story so that we can kind of relate how it might affect our lives. Because it's hard to talk about some of these things in just the big scope of they're big and they're global, but we need to understand how it works for individual people or for families. So that's sort of what I do too with my own work.
Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful thing to do with your own work. I think you are so excellent at conveying people's stories from all of the people that you've met and the things that you've experienced. Before we wrap up, I think our audience would love to have your social media handles. So where can our audience find you?
Well, I'm on Facebook. And you can find me either my author page, which is my full name, Timothy J.A.Y. Smith, or I also have just a personal page, and that's easy enough to look for. I have an Instagram account, but I'm not terribly active on it.
What is your Instagram handle?
It's my name, Timothy J. Smith.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I use that for everything. Twitter also, Timothy J. Smith. I suppose Facebook is the thing I use the most.
Okay. Well, thank you so, so much for joining us all the way from Nice. And to our audience, please remember to check out The Fourth Courier. It is an incredible read, and you will definitely, definitely enjoy it. Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you very much. Thanks.